What I think I may do is just to take advantage of the time that we have, the limited time, allow me to begin and kick off. So hello, everyone, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you for joining this virtual event today. My name is Justin Reash. I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society here in the United States and the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University. Before we begin the program, allow me to remind you of a few things. This conversation is being recorded and it will be on our YouTube page in the coming days. And second, we would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions for the guests today, please use the Q&A function on Zoom and we'll get to the questions later in this conversation. And lastly, if you're not yet a member of the International Churchill Society, we would be delighted to have you as one. You can join our ranks by clicking the link that will be in the chat here soon. And we appreciate all of the support that you're able to give. Now, allow me to introduce today's topic and guests. Churchill in Punch, the name of this program, is not just a new book by author Gary Stiles, but an exhibition at Chartwell, which is the former home of Sir Winston Churchill in Kent, England. Now, Churchill, it can be argued, is one of the most caricatured politicians in history. But how did he use these caricatures to cultivate his public image? And how did he feel about his many appearances in satirical illustrations? So I have asked Katherine Carter and Gary Stiles to help answer these questions and more. Katherine is a very familiar face to this audience. She's the curator of Chartwell and a historian specializing in early 20th century political history. She, as the curator of Chartwell, she leads the research, presentation, conservation, and interpretation of the house and its collections. Her exhibitions have included Death of a Hero, Into the Trenches, and Churchill and the Crown. Katherine is an associate fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And her first book, which is tentatively titled Churchill, Chartwell, and the Countdown to War, is being published by Yale University Press and due to be released, next year. And author Gary Stiles is a cardiologist, medical researcher who had a long career on the faculty at Duke University. He was the chief of cardiology and the chief medical officer for the Duke University Health System. And Duke honored him with an endowed chair, the Ursula Geller Distinguished Professor of Cardiovascular Research, for his work on the molecular understanding of cellular signal transduction. But most importantly for today's program, he is a lifelong admirer and collector of all things Winston Churchill and author of the new book, Churchill in Punch, which definitely, pardon the pun, packs a punch. It is a beautiful book and it weighs many, many pounds. And we also would like to thank Top Photo for allowing us to use the caricatures that you'll see later in this conversation, but of course in the book and the exhibition. So Gary, let's kick off by having you tell us, as a cardiologist, how did you fall in love with the Churchilliana and how you came about producing this book?
Thank you, Justin, very much. And thank you for holding this symposium. It's really great of you to do it. And Katherine and I appreciate it very much. So I have been a Churchill admirer for more than 40 years. I've been reading his works for more than 40 years and collecting everything Churchill, as you said, for that period of time. Over the years, like anybody who's interested in Churchill, I quickly realized that there were a fair number of Punch cartoons out there. And I was very struck by, one, the number of them, how often Punch covered Churchill, and also the great disparity in how he was portrayed. He was always caricatured with certain traits, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also most of them were very polarizing. They were either praising Churchill wildly or beating him up in a very terrible way, both his personal self and his politics. And so as time went on, I became more and more interested in the Punch cartoons and wondered how many there were. And so I began to research that aspect of it in terms of trying to find out how many Punch cartoons there were. I quickly realized that there was no publication that characterized his cartoons nor cataloged his cartoons. And so I began to search by the time I was doing this, there was good internet search engines. And I became aware that a fair number of Churchill bookstores, which that time there were 3 major ones, were selling them. And so I contacted each of the proprietors of the major Churchill bookstores and asked them how many Punch cartoons they had seen and how long the list was. And it was very interesting. Every one of them, to the person, said, well, I never thought about exactly how many. I certainly don't have a list of how many. But my guess is, and this is sort of a uniform answer I got, my guess is there's probably a couple of hundred. And so I began to search some more. And I did find a list on the internet, which was anonymous, that had a list of about 235 Punch cartoons. So what I wanted to do then was made the decision about 10 years ago, I ought to do this. I ought to try to find them all and see how I can do on that. And what I quickly found was by searching, there became more and more. And when I passed that number of well over 200, I thought, I really do have to work on writing this up. I think there's a niche for it in the Churchill books, even though there's over 1,000 books. I still figured there was room for one more at least. And so the idea of the book came to fruition, and I began to start collecting seriously all the cartoons I could find. And by the time I got to about 450 cartoons, and people will ask, yes, I do have every one of the 600 plus cartoons in a collection in my house. By the time I got to about 450, it was time to start planning what the book would be and start writing it. And so I continued to do that for a number of years. By the time I got to 600, the main core body of the book was written. And I decided to do a 2-pronged approach to the writing of this book. One was to have the central component of the book have every cartoon, have all the bibliographic information about when it was published in Punch and who the cartoonist was, and a short paragraph of the characters, the events, what the issue was, and put it in historical perspective, and do that in a way so that part of the book would stand alone for people who just wanted to see the cartoons and read about them, that they would have that. And I tried to write it in an enjoyable and fun kind of way. But being the academic that I am, I also wanted to offer more depth for people who wanted to dive in further and get to more substantial issues like how many people were with Churchill, what were the major issues, how often were these published in subsequent publications, and on and on. So I created a section of appendices for that, and I also wrote a brief introduction to each of the chapters. The chapters were set by decade, and what you see in front of you, I think coming up, is a picture of the book itself. Let me digress here for just a minute, and I'll come back to the structure of the book. This is the cover of the dust jacket. It is taken from a cartoon in 1954 celebrating Churchill's 80th birthday. And this was the cover. It was in color, just like you see on the cover of the book now. And what I want you to see in this cartoon is, obviously the cartoon has been changed. It didn't say Churchill in Punch in the original cartoon. It obviously didn't have my name in the original cartoon. But there are, and you probably can't see all of them, there are more than 30 little figures which outline all of the events and job titles that Churchill had. And it's a characteristic that I hope people will recognize about Punch cartoons was, although they had an overall message, they frequently had a lot more depth in them of pointing out other things that you had to search for and look at and understand them. So they're much deeper than what first hits you in the face when you look at the Punch.
Gary,
and so
just one question.
Now coming back to the structure of the book has the central part of 7 chapters, which have by decade of the cartoons. And then each has an introduction, which gives you some of the lay of the land of the politics and how they fit in. After that was put together, what I needed was somebody who was really good at reading the manuscript, doing fact checking, but much more give an overall perspective. And the person who I asked to do this is Richard Langworth, who I think all of you who are Churchillians know well, and I've known him for more than 40 years. And so he undertook the task of reading the entire manuscript and fact checking, and some of the obscure figures that are in it helped find out who they were, because we tried to identify every individual in every cartoon. And we used all of Richard's resources. When we then went to look to publish the book, everybody told me, you're never going to publish this book because none of the copyrights are gone. You'll have to pay for every cartoon through the company that owns the intellectual property. Well, that turned out not to be true. John Balin at Top Photo, who owns the intellectual property, worked very well with us to get this done. The publisher I chose was Unicorn, and Lord Strathcarron, who's the managing partner there, was very excited about the book early on and knew John Balin from Top Photo. So they quickly worked out all the issues of copyright, and hence the book was able to be published. I also want to thank Top Photo for allowing us to use all the cartoons over and over again. So with that, the book was published. It's now out, and luckily it's received some pretty good reviews, and it was a joy and privilege to write it, and I hope people will enjoy it. So with that, I'll pass it back to Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So one question before we bring Katherine. On this cover of the book, so just to confirm, obviously the cartoon that is on the cover does not say Churchill and Punch, but all of these little, tiny little caricatures all around, this was for his 80th birthday. And so they wanted to mark the, totality of his career to that point.
Yes, that's correct. It was published December 1, 1954.
All right, wonderful. So we'll X out of this photo. And Katherine, why don't you tell us how from, a book that is, really focused on decades of caricaturing Churchill, how did it become an exhibition at his home?
Yes, so first of all, I should say that cartoons were something that Churchill was really, really interested in during his lifetime. We have a number of cartoons in the collection at Chartwell. And I think there's something really interesting about Churchill's awareness of the importance of image recognition to electoral success and electoral popularity, as it were. And the fact that so many cartoons were done of him, he would have positively reveled in. For him, it is part of that exposure, part of brand Churchill, as it were. And because of that, I've had a long interest in political caricatures and political cartoons as a way of having a sort of litmus test as to what people are thinking about current affairs. Now, when I first heard that Gary was writing this compendium of cartoons of Winston Churchill, first of all, the sheer volume of them was astonishing. I don't think anyone before Gary's research had an idea of quite how many there are, in fact. And once I got to looking at Gary's book, I realized that it's not just a list of political cartoons. It is a way of visually telling the story of Winston Churchill's political career. And because there's that old saying of a picture is worth 1,000 words, what all these illustrators are doing are trying to convey sometimes quite complex political matters in a way that can be immediately understood from a quick glance. So it's a really easy way, you could argue, of telling a really complex story. And because what we do day in, day out at Chartwell is tell the stories of Winston Churchill's life, I couldn't help but seek out Gary and see if there was any way we could work together on the exhibition that we have at Chartwell at the moment. And so the exhibition consists of 20 cartoons. He and I picked 10 each, a number of which we'll be showcasing for all of our attendees this evening. And I think that it's just been a hugely popular way because it can be enjoyed on so many levels, from the quality of the illustration to the complexity of the subject matter. And yeah, it's just been a wonderful addition to what our visitors can see at Chartwell right now.
Tell us a little bit, before we get into the slideshow, tell us where on the grounds the exhibition is.
So because the house is closed for its annual conservation and maintenance at the moment, the exhibition is actually al fresco. So it's on our terrace lawn, which is just outside the house. And it's not original drawings, I should stress. These are digital recreations of the images kindly provided by Top Photo, as has already been mentioned. And so yes, if you come for a wander around the garden and to enjoy those beautiful views in that landscape, you can also see the exhibition as well.
Well, I think what we'll do now is we'll put up on the screen selected caricatures from both you and Gary. Why don't you take us through them, and then after this we'll get into questions that we already certainly have. And for those listening and participating, please continue to feel free to submit your questions. So let's begin with this.
So Gary and I have each picked a handful, and this was one of my favourites. And as I mentioned, everything you're going to see tonight is in the exhibition at Chartwell, which unto itself was a challenging process to take 600 plus cartoons and narrow it down to just 20. So narrowing it down to just 7 for you tonight has been even more of a challenge. But I think this one says so much about Winston Churchill at the outset of his political career. So the context is it's February 1901, Churchill has been recently elected as a member of Parliament, and he makes his maiden speech in February 1901. Now his maiden speech, I should say that's a term used for newly elected MPs, it's their first speech in Parliament, and he explicitly referenced his father. So the figures you can see, Winston Churchill on the left and Lord Randolph Churchill on the right, who has passed away some years before Winston Churchill was elected to Parliament. And the wording at the bottom, reviving a certain splendid memory, that is a quotation from his speech. So the phrasing used is, "I cannot sit down without saying how very grateful I am for the kindness and patience with which the House has heard me and which has been extended to me. I well know, not on my own account, but because of a certain splendid memory which many honourable members still preserve." So he knows that this really warm welcome he's had to the House of Commons is in part because of his father's legacy. And part of the reason that this is one of my favourites is because you can see already this very conscious mirroring of his father, from his posture, from his stance, through the choice of clothing. There is a very decided emulation of his father, because that is something he can tap into immediately. That is something that he can recreate in a tangible way. There is already brand Churchill in the House of Commons, so he can then attach himself to that existing brand. And so that's what we see playing out here with his father, a sort of ghostly, ethereal figure looking over his shoulder. So it's that idea of the cultivation of image, the very conscious curation of image from the very first speech he gives in Parliament. And we start to see this sort of chicken and egg of cartoonists conveying Churchill's traits and then him almost sort of playing up to them, which I know Gary will be speaking about more in some of his, but I think that this one particularly, it says so much about Winston Churchill and how he was positioning himself at the start of his political career.
All right, this is Gary Stiles. I'm going to talk about this one, but let me give you a little further background about Punch in the cartoons. So there were more than 50 of the Punch cartoonists who actually contributed the 635 cartoons. And the numbers are pretty astounding. The cartoonist known as A.W. Lloyd actually has 150 Punch cartoons of Churchill. And what I've done for the 4 that I'm going to talk about is sort of pick the 4 that I think have done some of the most amazing work. Bernard Partridge, who did this one, did 75. And another of the cartoonists was E.H. Shepard, who did 45. But to give you an idea of the quality of the cartoonist, E.H. Shepard also was the illustrator for the books Winnie the Pooh. So we're talking about somebody who really knew how to draw. And one of the things that people ask me about all the time is, well, who is shown with Churchill in these cartoons most of all? And for everybody listening, you can think in your mind over the 80 years that these were published, who might have been the most common other political figure shown. And after you've thought about that for 10 seconds, I will tell you who it is. It is actually David Lloyd George. So he is the most common politician shown, and he's shown 63 times with Churchill over the years. And as Katherine pointed out, Churchill indeed loved cartoons, and he bought a number of the original ink drawings, and they are at Chartwell, as Katherine has said. But it's also important to recognize that Churchill himself saw life as a theater or a play, with him being oftentimes the sole and most important character. And so he tried to control much of what his image was going to be, and used a number of caricatures and accoutrements and accessories to label himself so that he could easily be characterized and seen by the public and recognized immediately. And I think all of you can come up with your own list, but just for example, as you look at these cartoons, look at things like the hats he's wearing, his cigar, his clothes, his gait, his forward stoop, his hands on his hips, his V sign, the walking stick, and you can go on and on. But if you look at these cartoons over the years, you'll see the cartoonists have picked up on what Churchill has offered them and turned them into iconic, recognizable features of Churchill. So with that additional background, let me tell you about this cartoon. It's called The Well-Earned Increment. It was created in 1912 when Churchill, in fact, was the First Lord of the Admiralty. This is one of the cartoons that he bought, and actually in the Churchill archives is the letter back from Partridge to Churchill thanking him for his 10-guinea check, and then Churchill has kept it here. What this is about is this is a design for an Admiralty Christmas card by Partridge, obviously his recommendation. And Churchill is shown there as a cherub looking over the sea. And you see at the top are two threepence on each side. And you can also see there's the naval flags. And you can see Churchill carrying a little sack there with the numbers 386,000. That's the number of pounds that Churchill introduced into his budget to increase the pay and benefits of the regular routine sailor. And so this is a wildly positive cartoon about Churchill for all the good he has done for the seamen and for how well he was performing at the Admiralty. So this is one of the more really supportive cartoons, and it's fun, the detail. You can look and see more and more as you look at it. And clearly it touched Churchill's heart because he bought it. So you can go to the next one. This is another one that I've chosen to show because hats are a very important part of Churchill's costuming, and oftentimes the hat is too small. If we have time later, I can tell you the story of how it came to be, but all of the cartoonists picked up on this and showed him with a very small hat. Now, this is Churchill wearing the hat of the Canadian Mountie because he was going to be the colonial secretary. And what you see in this cartoon, and you may not be able to see it in detail, but behind him on a shelf are all the hats he had worn previously for all the jobs he'd had, Minister of Munitions and all of those. But at the very top shelf, you can see a hat box that's not been opened, and it's called Premiership. So even back in 1921, Ravenhill, who is the cartoonist here, was saying that the goal of Churchill was clearly to become the prime minister. And he's obviously at this time supporting it. And it's titled Hats That Have Helped Me. But he also shows, if you look at the body of the cartoon, it's showing images of all the things he's done. As a writer, it shows the pen and quill. It shows the army. It shows the palette of his being a painter. So again, the message is he's going to become colonial secretary, but you can learn an awful lot more by looking at the details within the cartoon. Again, Ravenhill's cartoons tend to be very carefully drawn, very detailed, and stock full of information for the reader.
Gary, before we move to the next one, if I can just say, this is a brilliant cartoon, with the metaphor of the hats and, and then the quote, of course, very becoming, but on the small side as
Yep.
usual. It's so fascinating that, like you said, 1921, I guess one that's missing, which of course would come, is the exchequer. But yeah, it's amazing, 20 plus, 19 years or so before he does become prime minister, how the public is even framing it as much as he wants it to be framed.
Yes, indeed, that's exactly right. But Churchill said from the time he was a small boy that he saw himself as becoming prime minister.
Sorry, please proceed with the next one.
Okay. This is another one of mine. So this is a cartoon called The Light of Epping. It's by Lloyd, who's another one of the really good cartoonists, and the most frequent one, as I mentioned, 150 cartoons. Now, this is showing a couple of interesting things. The Light of Epping is on the left. So that's a characteristic imagery of Churchill with his large collar. And it should be remembered that for many, many years, at least 2 decades, he tended to wear the very old style 1880s and 1890 clothes into the 1900s and 1910s, including this very large collar. And so they showed him with this big collar. He obviously has a hat on him, which is way too small. Again, another image that he liked to portray. But this is talking about something very serious and very important. So at this time in 1933, Churchill was obviously deep in the wilderness. The Conservatives have been moved out of office in 1929. And Churchill at this time was being very firm in warning of the dangers of Hitler and the dangers of German rearmament, much against the current policy of the government. And this is now referring to the fact that the BBC leadership refused to give him airtime on the BBC to express his views. And obviously what Lloyd is saying here is, on the left side is as Mr. Churchill thinks it should be, that is, he is the bright light and shining and telling people about the war, the oncoming war. And on the right is the BBC. They've put a candle snuffer over his head and not allowed him to speak. And so no matter which side of the argument you were on, you could take solace in this. But I think what Lloyd was really saying was censorship at this level is not a good thing. All right.
So this was one of mine, and for those of you who have visited Chartwell, you might well recognise the location. This is depicting Winston Churchill in his study at Chartwell, which is of course one of the reasons why it's a favourite of mine. Not only that, but I think the illustration is beautiful as well. So what the context is here, that we're 5 years on from Gary's cartoon that he just showed, and Winston Churchill has spent 5 years now sounding the alarm about Nazi Germany. And by November 1938, we have had the remilitarization of the Rhineland, we've had the Anschluss with Austria in March of this year, and we've had the Munich Agreement in September. And the context of this is that he's also, whilst making his campaign against Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, been writing his multi-volume history of his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. So that's the figure we see behind him with his hand on Winston Churchill's shoulder, and the life of Marlborough being shown on the shelves beside him in the study. But the wording underneath this cartoon says, "It was a great work," the life of Marlborough that is, "and I wish you could now add another chapter to your own career." And the wording on the document that he's reading reads "National Defence." So Winston Churchill has, as I said, been trying to sound the alarm for years by this point. One thing that's quite interesting, if you look even just to earlier in this year, so in March 1938 is one of my favourite of Winston Churchill's interwar years speeches. And he references Adolf Hitler as a boa constrictor and says, after a boa constrictor has devoured its prey, it often has a considerable digestive period. And he's referencing the fact that there keeps being these aggressive moves by Germany in terms of their foreign policy, and then things go calm. And everyone sort of assumes, oh, it looks like war isn't actually coming now because everything's calmed down. But actually, he's just being a boa constrictor who's devouring his prey. And later in the speech, he references that his appetite may grow with eating. So the more times that he gets his way and the more time that other European powers acquiesce, it's only convincing Adolf Hitler that he's got pretty much the free hand he wants in Europe. And one of the last lines of the speech is Churchill saying, if we continue on this path, we shall repent in blood and tears. I think it's really interesting that he's kept that phraseology from the speech in March of 1938. But by November, by the time of this cartoon, we're 6 months on and the international situation has worsened yet still. Churchill has earlier in the year been making a case that there should be a Defence Against the Realm Act. We should be starting to convert our commercial industry into preparations for a wartime footing. And so it is this situation where this idea that really Churchill is the man who should be writing the history of what comes next in terms of national defence. He has been making this case for so many years now, and if he is right and Hitler's appetite may grow with eating, really we do need to start preparing for war in the way in which Churchill has been campaigning for so long. But all this being played out visually here in this cartoon from within the walls of Chartwell, because so much of his campaigning in terms of his writing of speeches, in terms of him hosting individuals who are bringing him information about Germany, took place within the walls of Chartwell. So I really like how this cartoon positions the importance of that moment for Winston Churchill of being at his home in Kent. So yeah, we can move on to the next one.
All right, this is one of mine. Was published in Punch in January of 1942 and was titled A Bold Dream of Big Ben. And this is a really, I think, both humorous and touching that Churchill can be portrayed as just a little round moon face with a cigar on the face clock, the clock face of the Elizabeth Tower there with Big Ben behind him. And this refers to a time in January of 1942 when it was suggested that Churchill should electronically record and broadcast his speeches, his famous speeches, live to the public in the UK and around the world. And Churchill took this idea and thought about it and said, yes, I think let's try the one next speech and see how it goes. And then we'll decide whether we will continue to broadcast live from the House of Commons. Well, politics being politics, the party in opposition, although they were still in the cabinet, obviously, demanded that either they be given equal time after Churchill, as we sort of do now in politics, or they were quite happy to let him do it as long as they could scream and yell criticisms at him while he was speaking. Obviously, Churchill, being the man he was, took that under advisement and told Parliament that he would not agree to do that, that it was just not going to work. And again, although that's a great loss for those of us who have followed, that we never got to hear him as he broadcasted, it was probably the right decision politically and from a support of the war point of view. So again, a cartoon that has great detail in it by Shepard and saying a bold dream of Big Ben has been shot down. As Katherine mentioned, Churchill later recorded many of his speeches at Chartwell, and that is why we have his voice doing that. And here, it's a sad day for us who don't get to hear how he did it live. But anyway.
Gary, if I can ask, I have to say this one stumps me a bit. You know, the face on the clock, how do you draw, you know, what the text is saying and what the statement is saying, you know, the context of the cartoon or the caricature to the actual, you know, to the actual drawing?
I'm not sure I get what you mean, Justin.
Well, you know, like I mean, what is drawn on the caricature of the face and the clock, you know, how does that, you know, represent this controversy of wanting to be recorded and broadcast? You know, how do you pair the two, if you will?
Yeah, so I think Shepard in particular liked to put up images that made you think and understand it. This was shown, and also in the section of Punch called The Essence of Parliament, where they wrote about it. They actually describe in that article the events about asking Churchill to do this, and the opposition wanting to yell criticisms at him. So they were juxtaposed, so you could do it. If you saw this without that context, yes, it would be a little bit confusing of,
Yeah, fair.
is it just
fair.
saying that Churchill is a symbol of Parliament and Great Britain? The answer to that would be yes, but you would miss the point.
Got it. Got it. Definitely. Thank you.
Sure.
Please continue.
Oh, so this is my one. This is the last of the ones that we're going to show you today. So this is a posthumous cartoon, of course. It's from February 1984. And the reason I've chosen it is because, as well as conveying complex current events and in due course being really interesting source material for historians, these are cartoons, they are illustrations, they are there to be enjoyed. And this one, it just made me chuckle. So I love the idea of a panel show happening in the sky with Winston Churchill featured alongside Shakespeare, Beethoven and Einstein. I think he would probably have approved enormously of being considered in that lineup. And I think as well, there's something about how enduring Winston Churchill's legacy is. And one thing we've seen across all of these cartoons is the evolution of how he is portrayed. So from the very outset, emulating his father, and then rather than a sort of transformation of his image, it's more of an evolution. So we start to see these tropes and these traits, exactly as Gary said with the Hats cartoon, that are sort of added, these extra layers of image, so much so that we get to the point where he can even have his face put on an inanimate object like a candle or a clock, and you know it's Winston Churchill because his image has been cultivated so efficiently, so effectively. And so much so that even years after he passed away, he's still being depicted in Punch cartoons. And I just think this is a really lovely one, and it's a very relatable one, which is exactly, you know, I think the best cartoons are the ones where people look at them in the moment and instantly connect with them and know what they're saying. So it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of these ones we're looking at, we are looking at them now through the prism of history, but to the people for whom they were originally intended, they were conveying current events. So we have to look at them through a slightly different lens. But I think this one I love just because I think it's timeless. I think it's universal and it made me laugh. So that's why I chose this one.
Yeah, that's real. That's really well done, and it's kind of sweet in a way.
Yeah, I think so. I'd love to know who the other team were.
Well, thank you both for taking us through these selected 7 or so of 600 plus in your book, Gary. Is that right?
That is correct.
Well, you know, we've had many questions come through, so I think it behooves us to try to get to many as possible. But I would like to ask, I'd like to use some executive privilege here and ask Gary, have you discovered every cartoon of Churchill and Punch, and are all represented in your book?
Great question, Justin. The answer is not anymore. There are about 620 cartoons in the book. After the book went to the publisher, I continued to find a few more. And since the book has been published, 2 people have written to me about ones that I did not have in the book. And in fact, they weren't. What I will say, so the number now that I'm using is there were probably about 635 cartoons. The ones that are not in the book, though, are not ones that have an image of Churchill. They are ones where he is mentioned in the dialogue, or there's a comment at the bottom of the cartoon. So I will continue to do it, and I'll reach out to everybody who's listening today. Is if you find one that I have missed, I would love to hear it, and please let me know about it, because I want to continue to make sure I do have a complete list.
Well, you don't seem like a person to get ruffled too easily. So hopefully you weren't too disappointed when you got the email saying, "Oh, you missed you missed one or two."
Having done research for 50 years, I can tell you, I am never surprised when new facts come to light.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to go through these questions, and if we have about a little less than 20 minutes left, so we'll try to answer as many as possible. So I'm just going to start from the top. This is from Clive. If Gary could only choose one cartoon to hang on his office wall, which one would he pick and why?
Wow.
And if you need to think on it,
I'll need to think on that because I have favorite ones for very different reasons. And luckily, I'm not limited to one.
Yeah.
So let me think about that one and I will come back to you.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. It's a question from Naomi. Was it not possible to obtain definitive information on the Punch Churchill cartoons from Punch? I think this is in relation to why did you use Top Photo rather than, let's say the archive of Punch?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. It was a big part of actually getting this done. So Punch is defunct. The organization does not exist anymore. Punch stopped publication in 2002, and nothing much happened for a while. And then the company known as Top Photo, which we've mentioned before, bought the intellectual rights to all of the Punch materials, including the cartoons. And so at the time I finished writing the book, but before I had contacted Top Photo or Unicorn, Top Photo was offering about 180 cartoons on their website that they knew about. And so they didn't actually know all of the other ones. They had all the editions, but having the editions from 1841 to 2002 doesn't help you much unless you want to go through page by page, which obviously they didn't want to do. So I actually showed them over 400 more cartoons that they didn't actually know existed there. The other question related to this that I get frequently is, well, why didn't you just go to the index of Punch? Well, it turns out the index of Punch doesn't give enough detail in their indices to know that it's a cartoon about Churchill, or they may say Churchill, but it's not a cartoon. So, and they have a section called cartoons, but you can't use that. I tried, believe me, I tried, which would have been much easier than just having to search them out. So the bottom line is Punch doesn't exist. Top Photo has all the cartoons now, and they're now all available through their website.
Wonderful. Catherine, what same question, first question to you, what cartoon would you hang in your office and why?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. So of the Punch cartoons, I do like the panel game shows one just because it makes me giggle. And I think actually there's something about, I think that the cartoons where as curator of Churchill's home, I can sort of look at them and go, do you know what, I reckon he would have approved of that, or and there are some, as Gary said, where we know that he bought the original drawings and he wanted to own them. So of course with the panel games one, because it's so long after he passed away, there wasn't that option, but I think he would have bought that one if he had the choice.
Jay would like to know, was Punch the originator of Churchill as a bulldog? Do either of you know the answer to that question?
I know, I can tell you when, I have to look it up, I don't remember the date. They first portrayed him as a bulldog, but I don't know if there were other cartoonists who did it prior to that time. I've not actually searched that out to see who it is. They did it very early on in the if I remember, it's around 1919 they did it.
I was gonna say, Gary, is that the one with Lloyd George where he's a dog as well?
Yes, the one with Lloyd George.
Yeah.
When Lloyd George was, so it had to be about 1912 to 1914 because Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty and David Lloyd George was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and they had a small surplus, and the cartoon shows Lloyd George trying to bury this little dog biscuit, which is the money, and Churchill coming through the fence, a hole in the fence as a bulldog saying, wait, we need more naval money. And the two of them, it's a really cute cartoon.
That's pretty funny. Do we know what the editorial policy for Punch cartoons was? Were they friends or foes? or critics or admirers of Churchill? It seems like, if I can answer, and then it seems like from looking at your book and hearing you talk for the past 40 minutes, it was kind of all of the above, but a lot of admiration in many ways.
Yeah, so it's fascinating how it worked, because I didn't understand this until I started researching it. So the editorial board at Punch met once a week with all the editors and all the cartoonists, and they mapped out what they were going to highlight and what cartoons they wanted to have drawn. So it was not the cartoonists sitting at home thinking, oh, this is interesting about Lloyd George and Churchill and their battle. I think I'll draw a cartoon and just send it to the editor to be published. It didn't work that way. They would sit down and they would portray sort of what was the message they want to give, and the cartoonist would obviously come up on his own. But what often happened was there was not infrequently an editorial that went along with some of the major cartoons. The most dramatic and painful occurred in 1954 when Illingworth and Muggeridge, Muggeridge being the editor, Illingworth being the cartoonist, decided to create that image of Churchill after his stroke. It's called Men Goeth Forth, where the cartoon, I think, is the most mean-spirited, evil approach I've ever seen, because what they're highlighting is Churchill with an asymmetric face after his stroke. His hands are lifeless, and then there's an accompanying editorial by Muggeridge, essentially saying it's time for him to retire. He's well past where he belongs. That created the most outrage of any of the Churchill cartoons. It's the only one that I know of that Churchill absolutely hated, and there's long dialogue between Churchill and Lord Moran, his physician, about how much he heard it and how painful it was. And Muggeridge was never excused or given any leeway by Churchill after that. And it was actually a few years later, because of that, that Muggeridge was asked to leave Punch.
Was this Malcolm Muggeridge?
Yes.
Wow, I didn't know he was the editor of Punch. We've had quite a few questions on, do we know if Churchill had any relationships with these various artists?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I have not found any, but I must say I did not go back and read all the biographies of all the cartoonists and all. There is in the book a brief description of each of the cartoonists in the appendix and some information, but I don't know of any close personal relationships that he had with them. But he certainly enjoyed their work. He always went through cartoon magazines every week to see what they were writing about him. He was very interested.
Katherine, couple questions, I'm just amalgamating them. Do you know of any cartoons, you referenced many that he would keep, do you know of any that he displayed in Chartwell or that are on display at Chartwell?
Yes, so we have, in terms of original cartoons, someone called The Taxable Element, which leaps to mind, which it's a interwar years related. It's him and Lloyd George in a ship, and they're talking about sort of taxes in relation to maritime. Yeah, that one. Yeah. We also have some cartoons, though, in the Secretary's office, which are recent additions. So the Secretary's office only opened a couple of years ago, and we know from oral histories that it was on the south wall of that room where Churchill kept a lot of his Punch cartoons. Sadly, there wasn't a surviving list, but we've been able to find references to the sort of thing he liked, and so that we've recreated that. But in terms of the ones he owned originally, there's actually one we're about to bring out to put on display for, I think it's the first time it's been on display. It's been in our stores, and it wasn't actually referenced that it was Punch in our inventory. It was this cartoon that we had, and it's thanks to Gary's research that we now know the precise context of it and that it is a Punch cartoon. So we're going to bring that one out, but I'm gonna make you wait and see. Keep that on as a surprise.
There's a question for you again, Katherine, from Greg. Since the painting was one of Churchill's hobbies, did he ever caricature himself in a self-portrait painting?
So not a caricature per se, because caricatures tend to be sort of If it was a caricature self-portrait, it'd be self-deprecating, and I don't think Churchill would be the sort to depict himself in a self-deprecating way. But he did do a self-portrait. He also included himself as a very small figure in some of his larger landscape compositions, but there is one self-portrait he ever did that hangs on the wall of Chartwell. It's one of his earliest pictures, and it's a really interesting composition, actually. It's him very brightly lit in the center with dark negative space all around him. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting depiction, and a very early one of him. He's still got red hair, so that shows how young he is when he's painting it.
Yeah, I'm actually, I'm so moved by it. I'm actually attempting to, and I can't share my screen because I got a new computer, but I highly recommend those who are on this call, if you're interested, look up the self-portrait. Like Catherine says, it is not a caricature in any way. Just a couple. So here's a question from Lynn. What cartoon had the greatest impact on public sentiment in World War II? I would probably say, and I don't know if this is a Punch cartoon, so you guys can correct me, is that All Behind You Winston cartoon, if you guys know that one?
Yes.
Like I'm an Atlas, but is that a Punch cartoon?
Yes.
Oh, I had no
Is it?
idea. I love
No,
that.
wait, no, it's not. It is not a Punch
It's
cartoon.
not.
That one is not.
No, that's by Lowe, isn't it? And I don't know if
Yes,
Lowe ever
that's by
drew
Lowe.
Punch.
But from your book, Gary, do you have one, do you think, that had, a measurable public, impact during the war?
Yeah, there are a couple, I think. One was called, I think, Guardian of the Empire, which shows Churchill standing on the shores by the White Cliffs of Dover with his tin hat on,
Yes,
standing
yeah,
on
that's a great one. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
cannon from the 1500s, and then there are Spitfires flying over the White Cliffs of Dover, and there's a church tower there. I think that was really emblematic of Churchill rallying the people and them standing behind him as the guardian of the empire.
Yes, so that's Lord Warden of the Empire is the title of that cartoon,
Yes.
and that cartoon is on display at Chartwell.
This is from Eugene, probably best for Gary. How often did Punch cartoons reference his family relationships outside of his father, which obviously was already discussed?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Clementine was never shown in a cartoon in Punch that I'm aware of. None of his children except Randolph, and I believe there's two of Randolph. When Randolph was, I was going to say being renegade, but that would be redundant. When he was running for Parliament and created such a stir, there's ones of the two of them together. Other than that, I can't think of anywhere Jack, his brother, was in them. So it really was limited to just a few with Randolph.
I think it's worth. Sorry, I was going to say I think it's worth positioning. Punch cartoons are really primarily conveying current affairs, news, political events, and as a result of that, they aren't considering the sort of broader sweep of his life events. They really are depicting what's happening in the political fray and current affairs. So that's why I don't think it is in any way a sort of conscious decision to exclude the family. It's just that that's sort of not the primary purpose of the cartoons.
I agree.
Well, this leads to a question that Shepard Stone has asked a few times. Any cartoons of Churchill and cats that we know of in Punch?
Cats?
Yes, the feline animal. Because I'm guessing Shepard is referring to Jock, but to your point, Catherine,
Yes.
it's not so much, it's not about him personally, it's about capturing the moment, if you will.
Yeah, I can't think of any, but I'd have to look in the appendix. I list all those kind of things in an appendices, what kind of animals were shown with him, and I don't remember cats, but there may have been.
We'll get back to you, Shepard, about that. Because it's often, depicted as a dog, so I think it's a fair question. Question from Harry. I just received as a gift the Punch cartoon of Churchill leaping over the world. The world is looking up at him. it is related to the United Nations. Do the speakers have any comments about that one? I'm so happy to have this, and I look forward to buying Dr. Stiles' book.
Well, thank you for that, but I can't give you any more details than what's actually in the cartoon right now. I'd have to look it up, but if you send me an email, I'll be glad to look further and give you an answer.
Katherine, this is best probably answered by you. How would you interpret, this is from Eugene, the touching of Churchill's right shoulder by the Duke of Marlborough with the ducal baton in the scene in the study? How do you interpret that? I mean,
Well,
he kind of
it's
touched on it. Yeah.
yeah, the baton is something that is very much associated with John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. It's part of his own symbolism, you could argue. That there's a lovely moment years later in his career when Winston Churchill is given the freedom of Kensington, and the object that he's given is a replica of the Duke of Marlborough's baton. So it is something that is, as symbolism goes, you know, it's very consistently associated with the Duke of Marlborough. Churchill is a historian, holds that very, very dear to his heart. So, but in terms of a cartoonist is always just looking for those hooks to make it even more obvious who the people are that are being conveyed. So it is similar with Winston Churchill and his cigar. You could argue that John Churchill's equivalent is his baton.
So I'll end with two questions. This is from M. Cyrus. Was Churchill Freemason? Yes. Are there any cartoons of him as a Freemason? Do you know of, either of you two?
No, I do not.
So question is, last question. How was Churchill depicted in cartoon when he was voted out of the office right after the war in 1945? And then again, when he was later reelected? I think this is a good question for Punch.
Yeah, so when he was reelected, he's shown as a white knight coming back. It's a 1951 or 2 cartoon, and it's referring to a classic story of a white knight chilled coming and curing all the evils. When he left off or voted out of office, there were only a few cartoons, mostly sort of thanking him for his service. None of the cartoonists did anything negative about him getting, a booting out of getting a boot or anything like that. Most of them were just thanking him for his service.
I think as well, I would add to that, there's an interesting shift by which at that point when he's leader of the opposition and his role on the world stage changes to that of an elder statesman, but one who is still very heavily involved in international relations. Often that is where the shift for cartoonists moves to. So it's more his role on the world stage and that sort of what the world is looking like, post-war. So whether that be relations within and across Europe or the special relationship with America, it's often that is then being conveyed in cartoons at that time.
So very last question, and Clyde, thank you for remaining on the call. He said, does Gary have any further thoughts on his pick for the one he would hang in his office?
Yes, the one I mentioned before and Catherine talked about, Lord Warden of the Empire, is the one I would love to have hanging up because it's so emblematic of Churchill and what he did for the war.
Very good. Catherine, Gary, thanks for your time. This is very entertaining. I recommend Gary's book indeed. It's one of the few Churchill books my wife allows outside of my library at home. So, that's a ringing endorsement. Thanks again. Take care. And thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.